I am it is really a pleasure for me to welcome you to our annual Katzin Lecture. My name is Amelia Glazer. I'm an associate professor of Russian and comparative literature here at UCSD, and I direct the Jewish Studies program. And I'm so pleased that we have Professor James Loeffler here with us to give our annual Katzin Lecture. He'll be talking in just a moment about blind justice, the Jewish fight against anti-Semitism in post-war America. I wanted to first, before I introduce our speaker, say just a couple of words about the Katzin Lecture and about the Katzins. Miriam and Jerome Katzin were important supporters of the Jewish Studies program at UC San Diego, but even larger than that, they were big supporters of UCSD in many ways. They granted an endowment to establish the Katzin Prize to support UC San Diego graduate students, and we have a version of that that supports specifically UCSD grad students in Jewish studies. The Katzin Research Laboratories at UC San Diego, Moore's Cancer Center. They endowed the Katzin Chair in Jewish Civilization, which is currently held by Professor Lisa Lampert-Weissig in the Literature Department. The Courtyard at Muir College. They also endowed the Chair in Corporate Governance at the Rady School of Management. And they were important supporters of the Sulpicio Family Cardiovascular Center, among other funds at UCSD. They've also been involved in the San Diego Jewish community and gave in many ways around San Diego. So after their passing, we established the Katzin Annual Lecture, and it is appropriate, and I think they would have very much appreciated having Professor James Loeffler here with us. So I'll say a few words about our speaker now. James Loeffler is the J. Berkowitz Professor of Jewish History at the University of Virginia. He also serves as the Ida and Nathan Kolodiz Director of the Jewish Studies program there. His books, he has published, I think, 2 monographs as well as an edited volume, if I'm not mistaken. I'm probably missing things, but have won numerous prizes. These include Rooted Cosmopolitans, Jews and Human Rights in the 20th Century, which came out in 2018, and The Law of Strangers, Jewish Lawyers and International Law in the 20th Century. And he's also the co-editor of the Association for Jewish Studies Review, as well as a Kogod Senior Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in New York City. And I missed his first monograph, which was The Most Musical Nation, Jews and Culture in the Late Russian Empire. This was a book that came out in 2010 and was important for my own work in Russian Jewish-Ukrainian relations. It's a study of Russian Jewish culture, looked at primarily through music. And this book won the Association for Slavic and East European and Eurasian Studies USC Book Prize in Literary and Cultural Studies. It also won an honorable mention for the AJS Jordan Schnitzer Prize. His more recent 2008 book, Rooted Cosmopolitans, is a book that traces the history of Jewish involvement in human rights. And he does something really difficult here, which is to give an evidence-based account for Jewish humanitarianism, tying human rights, the questions of human rights, to questions around Zionism. And this book won the American Historical Association's Dorothy Rosenberg Prize for the best book on the Jewish diaspora. It also won the AJS Jordan Schnitzer Prize in Modern Jewish History. He edited, together with Maria Paz, The Law of Strangers, Jewish Lawyers and International Law in the 20th Century, which I believe came out about a year ago, if I'm correct. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Professor Loeffler. He'll speak for probably about a half an hour, maybe a little bit longer. And after that, we will have a question and answer section. I'll ask that if you have a burning question that you want to ask while Professor Loeffler is speaking, you can feel free to put that in the chat and we'll get to it at the end of the talk. But you're also welcome to ask questions. I will call on you, so just raise the little, there's like a little yellow hand that you can raise on the reaction button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask the question in your own voice. If you're having trouble finding either the chat or the reaction button, do this, wave your hands, and I will see you. I'll be scrolling up and down through the audience, so we'll make sure that you get to ask your question. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Leffler.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you tonight virtually and to deliver the Katzin Lecture. It's a really wonderful program you have, and I'm really happy to appear in it and to connect to it. I'm only sorry it's not in person. You have better weather where you are, I think, than where I am. But on a more serious note, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak about some work that I'm doing, you'll hear about, and I also to be here as a guest of Professor Glaser, who has blazed her path in the world of Jewish literary studies, and it's wonderful to reconnect virtually. I also just want to thank Anna Marie Buenaviaje, who from the Jewish Studies program, who helped facilitate all of this. So I'm going to start right away my talk by telling you the story of a riot. And I'll get right into the action, and then I'll explain what we're really talking about tonight. So on Thursday, February 7th, 1946, the West End Women's Club of Chicago played host to two of America's greatest white supremacists, Gerald L.K. Smith, who was the head of the America First Party, and Father Arthur Terminiello, who was known as, quote, the Father Coughlin of the South. He was a partially defrocked Catholic priest who had turned himself into a race theorist and an anti-Semite. These two men were on a nationwide tour to spread their doctrine of American white Christian nationalism. And the pair of bigots were joined by a third man named Frederick Kister, who was the head of an organization called Christian Veterans of America. And he was a candidate, a Republican candidate for Chicago's 9th district for Congress. So these men came to Chicago to speak. And about 800 people showed up in the hall to listen to them, while about somewhere around 3,000 people showed up outside the hall to protest. Who was outside the hall? It was a crowd that was very diverse. Young Jewish World War II vets still wearing their uniforms, some of them, local Christian clergy, African-American groups, labor organizers, civil rights activists, and a lot of other people who were just outraged and curious about the white supremacists in town. In his speech, Father Terminiello used that rally outside to stoke his audience's fears. And he said, quote, the atheistic, Zionistic Jews picketing outside threaten our lives and our liberty. Over in Europe, he told his audience, the surviving Jews have begun to exact revenge against the German Christians by murdering them. Here at home, our Christian boys who've returned from serving in the war can't find any jobs. They're losing out to Jews and African Americans. The federal government is slipping into the hands of a dangerous enemy. And he said, quote, our democracy is not a democracy, but a mobocracy ruled by communistic Jews. And then he hit on his peak applause line. All communistic Jews should be sent back to Russia. This is 1946. And members of the audience responded by shouting, kill the Jews. Outside the hall, meanwhile, things were turning violent. Bottles and stink bombs were flying through the air. The crowd was shouting epithets at the speakers inside. Fascist, strikebreaker, other things. There was a cordon of police protecting the hall, but after a few minutes, the local chief on duty said he'd seen enough and decided it was time to shut down the protest of the rally, right? Because they were getting too violent and too unruly. As the police manhandled these protesters, they began to take out their nightsticks and swing wildly, beating them. More rocks flew. One of them hit the police chief in the back, and very soon it had devolved into an ugly riot. Then the police began to actually beat and arrest the protesters. While this was happening, a man named Sam Heller, a local judge, was wandering through the crowd in search of his teenage daughter, Sonia. Heller had gone to the rally not to protest, but to hear for himself what the bigots had to say. He was a free-thinking lawyer turned judge, and he wanted to know how bad these bad guys really were. So he got a ticket to go in and listen to them. And after a few minutes, he said he'd heard enough and he left. And then he went looking for his daughter, who was there protesting. He couldn't find her, and he grew alarmed because things were turning really ugly really fast. He said to his companion, the man standing next to him, "This is a hell of a way to protect the city. I'm one of the suckers who have to pay taxes for this." And he went on to say that the police are basically beating the protesters and protecting the white supremacists at this rally. Heller heard that the protesters were being hauled into vans and taken to a local police precinct. So he rushed over there. And he rushed over there to find 19 young people being held without charge. They hadn't been arrested, they were just being held. One teenager was bleeding profusely from his head, another one was unconscious. Judge Heller was infuriated, and so he summoned a clerk, a bailiff, and another judge, and he held court right in the police station. If you're looking at the pictures I've put up here, you can actually see him holding court there, and Arthur Timoniello, the renegade Catholic priest on the right in the dark black frock. They're having a hearing. And basically what Judge Heller said at that time was, "I'm ordering the protesters to be released. They haven't committed any crimes. You haven't charged them, so let them go. And I'm ordering Smith and Terminiello to be arrested on grounds of incitement to riot with racist anti-Semitic speech." Here are those two men, the two speakers coming in to be charged. And here they're submitting themselves to this under protest. These two men went on charged, tried, convicted of breaking the law of Chicago. This was despite the fact that then in 1946 included an all-white, all-Christian jury and non-Jewish judge. The defense for these two speakers had claimed, if trial in this city, if you let Jews onto the jury and if we have a Jewish judge. And they were accommodated in that. And they still lost. And they appealed. And that case went all the way up to the Supreme Court in 1949. Now, Chicago, this became an important landmark in constitutional debates about free speech and hate speech. You can see here initially the headline from the Chicago case: jury finds Terminiello guilty, diatribes against Jews read to court. Basically, his mob began to try and start another riot at that point. But the court case was appealed, as I said, and went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And there it became a landmark because in a close 5-4 verdict, the US Supreme Court ruled in Arthur Terminiello's favor. I'm not going to talk too much about the technicalities of the law here. Maybe in the Q&A, if there are those of you who are interested, I'm happy to say more. The court ruled on procedural grounds involving the jury instructions that his rights had been violated. He did not have a fair trial. In a blistering dissent, Justice Robert H. Jackson wrote one of the most famous lines in all of American legal history. Jackson, you may know at this time, had just come back from the Nuremberg trials, 1946. He was the chief prosecutor. We are, by the way, in the 70th year this year of the beginning of those trials. 75th year, excuse me. He announced what he called this misguided and dangerous focus on free speech at a cost to the safety of society and democracy itself. And he issued his famous line, "The Constitution is not a suicide pact." Now, you won't find this episode in any American Jewish history book. And there are, let me hasten to add, many excellent books about American Jewish history. The reason is because most historians who go to tell the story of anti-Semitism and civil rights and Jews after World War II say that it's not actually that important. What's more important is a triumph of justice and equality, and a triumph of something that I call civil liberties in a libertarian key. Against censorship and segregation, McCarthyism and school prayer, American Jews chose CIS as their strategy for legal equality in post-war American society. They fought for full and equal, and I'm just seeing, I may up a little bit. So I'm going to take and expose all of you to my, I will expose all of you to my
Yeah, I think that taking off the
Let's
backdrop may
see.
help a little
Now
bit.
you can see where I really am.
There we go. And it's dark there.
Happy to come. And we can stop share screen if things really get a little crazy for us. But I'll continue by telling you that what happened after World War II is that American Jews said, we want full and equal citizenship for ourselves, right? And others. And we want to be treated neutrally. We don't want to be discriminated against, nor do we want to be labeled or marked out. And we want to be able to have a society in which the First Amendment protects us. And we want, in a word, 2 words, blind justice. Keep America's promise of democracy, remove segregation and discrimination against racial minorities, remove the Christian elements inside our society that violate the Constitution, and you've solved the problem of anti-Semitism, and you've solved the problem of democracy as a whole. The price to pay for that freedom and equality, most American Jews concluded, was that you might have to accommodate some hate speech. You might have to live with speech that you didn't like and was offensive or dangerous, but that was the price you paid for the freedom. And I think, as I'll argue to you tonight in my remarks, this is a kind of libertarian position, not in terms of necessarily the way we think about economics, although we could talk about that, but in terms of the way how far one should take liberties and how much the government should regulate the conduct of people to protect other people. This orthodoxy, if you will, continued after World War II, and it neo-Nazis in 1977 in scope. And as you may well know, we are now in another period of great debate about free speech and hate speech and anti-Semitism. After Charlottesville and Squirrel Hill and Jersey City, and the executive order from President Trump about anti-Semitism, there is a debate in American society, as well as among American Jews, about what's the right strategy to fight anti-Semitism. This is what I'm writing a book about. And the book is focused on a number of these key moments and key trials where you can see these debates happening. One of them is this trial I mentioned to you a few minutes ago. And my argument is going to be that we need to not only recover this forgotten history, but also recover the forgotten ways of thinking about liberalism and about hate speech and free speech that were left behind in this moment after World War II, as things settled into what we now recognize as kind of a more familiar model of interpreting the First Amendment and thinking about free speech and hate speech. So what I'm going to do for the remaining minutes is I'm going to turn back to that 1946 riot, and I'm going to tell you a story of it from before the riot. And I'm going to argue that we can see 2 different visions of what liberalism means for American Jews in that moment. These 2 strains are basically competing with one another. And if we look closely at them, we can see not only their competition, but we can see how the debate between them parallels debates that we very much deal with today in terms of how to stop anti-Semitism, can law stop it, and what should be done. Now, Judge Heller did not spontaneously decide to attend the rally just to find out what those darn bigots were up to. He didn't actually decide to open court spontaneously at the police station and charge the 2 speakers with riot incitement. It turns out that the rally outside is not a quick mobilization in the face of a new threat. All of what I just described to you was planned, and the planning had begun a year before. What do I mean by that? During World War II, Chicago had become a hotbed for white supremacy. As local Jewish leaders fiercely debated what to do about it, they began to split into 2 camps. And the 2 camps really represented 2 positions about how to fight anti-Semites and what the law can do to help with that process. On one side stood a coalition of the local Anti-Defamation League leadership. And it should be said that the Anti-Defamation League, which may be familiar to some of you tonight, at that time was a couple decades old, but it was really still developing and growing into a national organization. It was still sort of figuring out what its purpose was. The Anti-Defamation League was joined by the ACLU, an organization that was also growing dramatically in this moment, American Civil Liberties Union, the American Jewish Committee, and a group called the Chicago Council Against Racial and Religious Discrimination, led by an interesting fellow named Homer Jack, who had been born Jewish and become a Unitarian Christian and a civil rights activist. These people, and I'm going to call them legal libertarians, they sought to challenge segregation in Chicago via civil disobedience, and they sought to defend civil liberties. When it came to anti-Semitism, they argued, hate speech was the price to pay for free speech. So they basically had a vision which said, we need to stop the laws of segregation in the city and beyond in America. And what we really need to do is also use free speech to defend progressive politics, to be able to let labor organizers do what they want to do, as well as to support democracy as a whole.
I'm going to just really quickly, if you don't mind, I wanted to quickly suggest that I can actually share the screen from my computer.
Okay.
I think you're having a couple of little, it's not terrible. We can still hear you, but it might be a little smoother.
Glitches? Okay.
For the audience. So I'll go ahead and just share my screen.
Okay, so I'm gonna
There we go.
cut off that and okay. Great. So I hope that this will work a little bit better. And thank you all for bearing with us.
You'll just have to tell me when you want me to.
Yeah, I'll just say next slide, as we used to do back in the day. Okay, so I'll continue, and Amelia, Professor Glazer, you'll tell me if I'm really getting crackled up. Perfect. So there was this group that I've told you about, who were very principled in what they saw as their struggle for freedom and equality and civil rights and justice. But they also did not want to mess with free speech, and they took a very expansive view of what it should be. If you want to hit the next slide now. The other group against them that rallied, and I think one more slide, if you don't mind. Yep, was a group that I call the legal communitarians. This was a group led by the American Jewish Congress, another major Jewish organization at the time. It also included a coalition of Jewish trade unions, youth groups, Jewish veterans groups, liberal Christian clergy, and another organization called the Chicago Civil Liberties Council, which was basically a more radical version of the ACLU. What was their take? Very simple. They wanted anti-defamation laws. They wanted to ban hate speech. They wanted to essentially say that in this country, we ought to be able to ban racist and anti-Semitic speech, and we should use the power of law to do that. That is how we're going to help achieve democracy. That's how we're going to help protect African Americans and Jews and other minority groups. And they were part of a movement across the country that was promoting this through creating laws in cities and states, and actually eventually promoting a federal law, a bill, to create something called a group libel. They reasoned that if you could have labor unions who protect workers, you could have organizations that also represent minority groups in giving them a collective status to protect their rights when they were under assault. Next slide, please. This position was most clearly laid out by the legal director of the American Jewish Congress, a man named Alexander Berkowitz. And you can see the quote here, I hope, where he says, people singled out for attack as a group have the right to defend themselves as a group. The enforcement of anti-defamation, anti-discrimination laws should not be left to individual initiative only, but minority organizations should be given the power analogous to that enjoyed by the unions under the National Labor Relations Act to file charges of unfair practices. Now, if you're looking at that slide, you may also notice that there's a brief there, a legal brief, which is related to a case that this man, Berkowitz, filed at the Federal Communications Commission, which involved basically stripping different organizations of their rights to broadcast because of the hate speech that they were broadcasting. In the face of the arrival, or the coming impending arrival of Terminiello and Smith to Chicago, the American Jewish Congress's new committee to combat anti-Semitism decided to use a law that was on the books. And this law actually dated back to 1917 in Illinois in response to anti-Black race riots there. And they decided to use this law to stop this group of bigots from, quote, inflaming against a racial or religious group. And they essentially devised this strategy, which was one in which Judge Heller would go with a fellow activist to witness, and then he would turn to the witness, he would turn to this activist and say, do you want to file a complaint against the neo-Nazis? And the activist, Ira Latimer was his name, would say, yes, I do. And then they would do this. Now, what's remarkable about this is that this was openly debated across Chicago for several months before the rally and the riot actually happened. It was being debated openly up until 2 days before this happened. And it was being debated because these two groups bitterly divided over how to respond to hate speech and how to respond to racists and anti-Semites. As I said, one group said, let free speech be our guiding principle here, and don't give them the attention, don't turn them into martyrs. The other group said, no, what we have to do is stop them from speaking because they will lead to violence. And the Constitution allows us to do this. Let's use that power. Next slide, please. During and after the subsequent trial, the debate continued. And you'll remember that the Terminiello in particular, the other people involved had different fates, but Terminiello was put on trial and he was convicted in Chicago. And this is the moment in which the debate explodes into a larger debate about what should be the larger direction of actually, from the Jewish perspective, the civil rights movement. The Chicago Jewish Sentinel, one of the main newspapers, said, this conviction has vindicated our approach. You can see up here one of the headlines, the Shah policy must end. We have crushed the false camouflage of the freedom of speech, ending the possibilities for hate mongers to spread venom without legal retaliation. Judge Heller, who was a sitting judge, nevertheless went on to lobby for more robust laws. And he organized a group that was part of this effort, as I mentioned, across the next 5 years to say we need more laws like this, more expanded power to stop hate mongers. The Supreme Court in 1949 took up this case and it ruled against that and in favor of Terminiello, the priest, on procedural grounds. Next slide, please. But just 3 years later, the same Chicago coalition effectively won a reversal because there was another major case. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into it, but it was another one of the white supremacists who was based in Chicago, was also convicted. And his case, he took all the way up to the Supreme Court against the state of Illinois. And there he lost. And there the Supreme Court actually decided you can have these constitutional bans on hate speech, and you can arrest people for promoting hate speech. In this particular case, it was actually pamphleting and using the media to spread anti-Semitic and racist hate speech. And the man involved happened to be involved in something called the Cicero race riot, which, as historians have documented, was one of the most horrible incidents of racial violence in the post-World War II period directed against African Americans who were attempting to integrate a neighborhood outside of Chicago. So the stage was set for something dramatic to happen in terms of Jews pushing for fighting anti-Semitism through the law. But it didn't happen. And as I said at the beginning, it didn't happen because there was a change, and there was a change in how American Jewish civil rights organizations began to think about it. These two different groups I've described to you actually converged. And the people who said we need these kinds of laws, and the communitarians, if you will, who thought about group rights and group protections, changed over to join the others. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what do I mean by that? I mean that at that time, American Jewish civil rights activists decided that the most important thing we can do is fight to bring an end to racial segregation. And so many of these groups were very active in the case that became Brown versus Board of Education. And they also said, we need to fight for free speech. One reason, which we can talk about in the Q&A, is that a perception that progressive politics were now under threat. The McCarthy era was happening, and there was a fear that all kinds of people were being attacked and put in serious legal danger for their political views. And the anti-communist hysteria was severe enough that it was important to strike out in favor of free speech. So you had this complex landscape happening. And in the words of the American Jewish Congress's legal expert, the man who took over from the man Pekulis I mentioned before, Leo Pfeffer, he said, at that time, the libertarian aspect of our philosophy became dominant. Leo Pfeffer went on to become probably the single most important lawyer in separating church and state for the decades from the 40s up until the late 70s. He was immensely important in many of the cases that are now being debated in American law at the Supreme Court about religious freedom, about adoptions, about questions about government support of religion. All of this is basically testing many of the things that he achieved through his work in the decades after. And he basically said, free speech works for the benefit of civil rights, due process, equal protection. Those are the best antidotes. We don't want to go chasing aggressively against the bigots. We simply want to create a sphere of equality for Jews and everyone else. We want, in other words, a race-blind, faith-blind, group-blind, individual kind of civil rights. And hate speech in this period came to be seen as the great exception, as opposed to something that we're always trying to balance. Is this appropriate or not? It came to be seen as something very far away from free speech and basically the smaller thing inside the huge world of free speech, as opposed to a different arrangement that was imagined at that time. Now, next slide, please. So this situation really persisted in the way I tell the story until the 1970s, and then it was tested again. As the civil rights movement began to break up, and as neo-Nazism began to try and revive itself, a group of neo-Nazis famously tried to march in Skokie, Illinois, which was the home of the largest community of Jewish Holocaust survivors at the time. And American Jewish activists and groups really were struggling. They struggled about how to respond. It did not seem right that the Nazis, people who called themselves Nazis, could come in and stoke fear and terror in the town of a Jewish community like this. But civil liberties was the bedrock principle of liberalism and of civil rights. And the situation became more and more complicated when race and racism entered into the equation that same year. First and foremost, the Jewish Defense League, a militant group led by Meir Kahane, showed up in Skokie and said, we're here to fight Nazis. We're here to practice violence against the violent. And we're also here to say to American Jews, you're not being taken care of by the society anymore. Your civil rights really don't matter. In fact, racial minorities are going to walk all over you, and the neo-Nazis are going to walk all over you, and you're basically going to be defenseless. That same year, race and racism entered into this because the Supreme Court took up the first major affirmative action case involving college admissions in the state of California, as it turned out. Admissions for the university system. And the American Jewish groups, the same groups I've been telling you about, were torn. They couldn't decide, should we support affirmative action or not? And in the end, most of them decided not to support affirmative action, but to oppose it and to say, this is a violation of liberalism. Treat people like individuals. Once you start doing this, you're going down the path back towards, as they put it, the site of discrimination we fought against. Now, I mention that because, as you can probably tell from what I'm describing here, these are complicated issues about how to understand what justice should do, and they're issues that we're still very much dealing with today. Next slide, please. I'm not going to tell you much about Charlottesville. As I come to the end of my formal remarks, I just want to say that Charlottesville also raised these same questions for American Jews. The same questions about how do you stop hate? What role should we give the law to do it? Can you stop these people from congregating and exercising their constitutional rights? And of course, what is the role of anti-Semitism in all of this? And I'll say it's just, we can just stop screen share. And from here on out, I'll just speak directly to all of you. After Charlottesville, there was a debate, not simply who's at fault and about President Trump, but there was also a big debate about what could have been different, what law could have been used to oppose these neo-Nazis for coming. And there was a debate too about why is it, if anti-Semitism and racism are both clearly coming from the white supremacists, that it seems as if our country doesn't know how to understand how they relate to each other and how we should pursue both of these things. And there was also a debate because, as you may remember, it feels like a long time ago already, but the Trump White House issued an executive order which said, in response to anti-Semitism, we have a tool. We're going to expand the protections of civil rights for American Jews. And this was greeted by some Jews with great hope and relief, and by others with great cynicism or even fear, because some Jews view this as a cynical ploy of conservatives politicizing anti-Semitism, and others view this as a necessary tool to finally make the law stretch to protect Jews in ways that it hadn't done after World War II. Today, we're in the midst of a serious set of debates about the power and the limits of law in this country. We revere law, I think it's fair to say, but we also question it. We want law to stand above politics, but we recognize that politics shape law. And that's true, even more true, we might say, when we think about anti-Semitism. We want the law and the politics to be separate, but we recognize that they're not fully separable. And then we're stuck, I think, many times about thinking about what do we do and what's the right way forward. In that sense, I want to suggest as I close that we're back at the post-war moment. Like then, we are asking a set of questions about liberalism's promise and its limits. And we're asking, is the solution to prejudice that we should majoritarianize, if you will, civil rights, making American law into one uniform blanket? There should be no special hate speech provisions. There should be no preferential admissions and different forms of affirmative action, government contracting. We shouldn't have those. Or should we be asking for civil rights to become more nuanced and more responsive? And we should, in fact, think about it as needing to expand to protect Jews in new ways that they haven't been protected under the law up until now. Is the task, in other words, to make justice truly blind once and for all, or is it to teach us to see the law and for the law to see difference in new and necessary ways? And those are the questions that I leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really a fantastic talk, and I know that there will be many questions as we transition into the Q&A portion of this evening's event. I wanted to quickly note that this is the final event for the winter quarter, and that our next event will be the first event of the spring quarter, which will be on April 26th at 10 a.m. because of the time difference for one of our speakers. This will be a book presentation by our own Professor Mira Ballberg, and I think that Anna Marie can actually put some of the event details into the chat. So I'll open it up for questions. Again, you can add questions to the either to everyone or to me directly in the chat, or you can raise your little yellow hand under reactions, and I'll make sure to unmute you so that you can speak. We have one question that already came in from Leslie, wanting to know just a little bit more about Mrs. David Woodlinger, and reminding us, of course, that this is International Women's Day, and so she wanted to start us off with a question about one of the women who appeared on one of your slides. Wondering if you can expand on that.
Sure. Let me just pull up the slide. So just so I can, yes. So she was a very interesting person, and this is a book that is in progress. So one of the things you do when you write a book in progress is you go trying to find out who are these people, right? Some of them were easier to find than others. The judge I mentioned because he gave a lot of interviews and he had a public career. Mrs. Woodlinger disappeared from the radar screen after this, but I can tell you she was essentially a communal leader, a philanthropist who'd been involved in supporting the Jewish community and other civic causes in Chicago. And she was somebody who took a strong position in this and was also active in women's groups in promoting these ideas. But she faded from the scene. And it's one of the interesting things. There was a lot of people like her who were kind of emboldened by this moment to step into the public sphere. And many of them continued, of course, but some of them stepped back, and she's one of the people who sort of flashed up on the screen and disappeared. I'll tell you, since this is a book in progress talk, I'm still looking for some more information about her. I'm trying to find some papers of hers, because one of the things, if you'll indulge me for 1 second, one of the things about gender and women in this story is it's quite interesting. On the other side, some of the most vicious anti-Semites and racists in Chicago, there were a couple of women who were very, very prominent in that sphere also. And they were leading the charge, actually, and doing it in a kind of, there was a national newsletter published out of Chicago called Women's Way, not to be confused with Other Women's Way, which basically promoted this idea that the Jews were going to destroy America and that all good women needed to protect their families and so on and so forth. So Mrs. Woodliger was kind of the opposite side of that, right? She was fighting for justice and against this at that moment. That's what I can share.
Thank you so much. And I did want to mention that I didn't mention this in my introduction, but the Katzins were both from Chicago, so it's appropriate. We were talking about Chicago, and Jerome Katzin actually got his law degree in Chicago. So there's many connections. I'll wait for more questions to come in, but I'll go ahead and privilege myself as someone with many questions. In the meantime, I'm very, very curious about, this is the McCarthyist moment, as you mentioned, that you're talking about, in the midst of these debates in the more centrist public sphere about human rights. So I'm wondering how party conversations about civil rights entered this. I mean, these were times when you had Soviet writers writing about Brown versus the Board of Education,
Yeah.
and how did that conversation influence the people that you're studying?
Sure, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, I think that the way to understand it is 1946, 1947, 1948. That's a very particular moment, and people are trying to figure out what is the link between justice and civil rights at home and global justice, right? My last book about human rights focuses a lot on that 1948 moment, because it's a moment where some people, some African-American leaders say, hey, we should take our case for civil rights to the UN, right? The United Nations exists, and we can make this an international cause. And certain leftist groups also say, absolutely, that's the way we're going to make this country, more democratic, if not push it further towards a social democracy or even more, left. And there's a great debate about this. Things are kind of unclear. That's one of the reasons that you see people sort of breaking into groups, because most of these groups I've mentioned, who are active in this moment, are non-communist. Some of them are sympathetic to the dilemmas that face party activists and face progressives and non-communist socialists in the US. Others are deeply anti-communist and basically they don't want to be tainted by it. And this parallels the debate that happens inside the civil rights movement among African-American leaders, right? If you ally with foreign forces and communist forces and even just progressives, will you lose your chance to convince America that you shouldn't be threatened by us and our demands for equality? And the parallel debate basically takes place in this moment among the Jewish groups I'm talking about. And they're kind of watching with one eye that debate, and they're watching this civil rights problem. And it doesn't help them, I think, that the white supremacists I'm talking about say, well, you're all commies and you just want to shut down free speech and you're un-American. And they say, in terms that are eerily similar to some rhetoric you hear today, even if you don't like what I say, you got to agree with me that I'm fighting for free speech. And those guys are the tyrants, to tyrannical forces that want to shut me down, and they'll come for you next. So it's a battle for public opinion, right? And this is a moment where things are kind of shuffling. And at that moment, many of these groups say, okay, we want to essentially say, we are no longer going to give the radical right the excuse to say that we're pro-communist. And we also recognize that many other things that we care about, such as the press and newspapers and books, and even pornography, that this is actually going to be a tool for liberalizing our society. And so free speech will work better for us here if we push it that way.
Thank you so much. Peter Gorovich has a question in the chat, but Peter, I wonder if would you mind unmuting yourself and you can go ahead and back up, because I think you were referencing something that was said earlier.
Thank you. I think this is just fantastically interesting talk. It actually reminds me of I read Philip Sands's book on East-West Street, and it's the argument that goes on at Lauterprecht and Lamprecht about genocide and human rights debate, which is a similar group versus individual thing. But my question was, would you analyze the advantages and disadvantages of each strategy for the Jewish community in particular? And then I was wondering whether would you answer differently depending on what ethnic group in America you were talking about? I mean, that's two big questions, so I don't want to ask the second one. I just want to ask just answer the first one. If Jewish organizations called you up and said, what are the advantages and disadvantages of each strategy, what would you say?
Okay, sure. Thank you. Right. Well, there's two different questions within your first question, which is the advantages and disadvantages of the strategies back then or today. And I'll speak about back then, and assuming that we'll end up talking about today eventually. Here's what I can tell you. There were those who said, to achieve civil rights in this country, we need a coalition of different groups. So in order to do that, we need to recognize our common interests, and banding together will be useful to us. And it will, this is one of the arguments why these Jewish groups support civil rights. They believe in it for African Americans and other racial minorities, and they say this is better for us. So they see this as a clear advantage to go that direction. I'm going to give you a more specific anecdote, which I think explains it nicely. These groups worked very closely with the NAACP, and the star lawyer at the time was Thurgood Marshall Jr. In the second case I mentioned that went to the Supreme Court in 1951, the lawyer for the defendant reached out to the ACLU and said, we want your help. And the ACLU said, okay, we'll help you because we believe in free speech. And then the ACL reached out and asked Thurgood Marshall Jr. to help with the appeal. And he agreed. And the rest of the NAACP was disgusted with him because they said, how could you possibly defend a white supremacist? And Thurgood Marshall Jr. said, basically, this is the key to our larger strategy of saying we're going to create a race-blind society. We need to say we promote the First Amendment, and this strategy will be helpful for us. And this is before Brown versus Board of Education. But he'll say we all should be treated just equal, right? So talking about special protections for minorities and hate speech, this is not going to help us to make the case of just what you might call like a classical liberalism. And Thurgood Marshall, therefore, is willing to defend the white supremacists to do it. This is similar to what happens 30 years later when a man named Aryeh Neier, then the head of the ACLU, a Holocaust refugee, Jewish man, defends the neo-Nazis in Skokie. And he too argues, I know many people think, how can you as a Jewish person do this? But I think that this is necessary for the greater good of democracy, right? So it depends on how you see, whether you believe the greater good is the advantage, it's going to make the laws work, or if you think that we need to kind of stamp out specific kinds of threats, which are illiberal threats and are not going to go away otherwise, then you would say that we need the strategy of more robust laws to shut down these groups. So I don't want to go too long on this. I do think it does vary for different groups, but many of them are trying to decide, well, to get anything done, we need a coalition. So how much is this directly in our interest versus only partially in our interest? Now, I want to make one other comment about this, which is important to say in light of the debates that we're having in this country right now about race and about racism and whiteness. For many American Jews, they said, we don't want to be marked as different. We don't want to stick out legally. In fact, if we support African-American society and getting equal rights, that's fine. And in the process, we're also going to basically make sure that we're seen as white. We do not want to be asking for special protections. And you referenced a book about, a lot of it's about Eastern Europe, about protections that call Jews an ethnic group. We don't want the law to see us, right? This is shortly before the time that American Jews fought very hard to keep religion off the census. They didn't want the American government to be able to count Jews. They didn't want Jews to stick out as non-white. So that's a part of it too. It's a tangled puzzle. And I think that there is a debate at that time among people who say, wait a second, we need to express our identity and the law should allow us to do that. And if we don't, we're basically going to assimilate, or we're simply going to end up not recognizing, all the possible ways we can use the law to protect ourselves.
So we've got several questions that are accruing, and I just wanted to calm everyone's mind in case you're worried that it ends right at 6. Our talks usually go with the Q&A until 6:15. So we have a little bit of time. I wanted to invite Lorraine Ratner to, if you wanted to ask the question in your voice. Lorraine, would you like to do that? If you can unmute yourself. Is Lorraine still with us in the Zoom room?
I can't find myself. Am I there?
We found you though. That's okay.
Oh,
There you are.
how cool. Okay, I'm in a terrible quandary because for two things. You left us with a question at the end of 2 ways to go regarding civil rights, majority rule, and the concern for minority rights. And with no answers, I may add, what can we as concerned participants in this debate, which is far more universal than just our country and our religion and all that, what can we do regarding free speech versus the protection for minorities? I'm liberal, I believe in free speech, but I don't believe in speech that denigrates and accuses and threatens any minority, sexual, gender, color, any of that. So I don't know what to do. I don't know where to put my energies, and because they're totally in conflict. And I argue with my Republican conservative friends about this all the time. And I'd love to hear your comments.
Sure, thank you. Well, you're right. I didn't give you an answer. I gave you a choice. God willing, as we say, there'll be a book soon. And in the book, I'll give you my answer at the end of the book, but you got to wait for the end of the book for that to happen. You're right, though. These are really hard questions. They're not only American questions. I think that we can establish a couple key principles that can maybe help us. The first thing we can say is that, the United States is unusual in how much we skew towards an unfettered standard of free speech. Many, many other robust democracies in Europe and elsewhere actually have more specific limits about certain types of extremist speech. And I don't think that has stopped them from becoming just as democratic as they could be. So I think it's important to recognize that we can talk about it and debate it, but we're already starting from a certain position. That's part of what I'm trying to convey here. And the law scholars who focus on this have shown us, we start from a position where we've kind of gone all the way over here in terms of saying we couldn't imagine banning this stuff. And if we do, there will be terrible repercussions that will destroy the speech of minority groups or political minorities, right? And there's debates about this, what that means. The first thing I would say is we can learn from the rest of the world, and we can test our ideas and policies out by looking at what happens in other places and how they deal with things such as banning certain types of racist speech. The second thing I would say is that one way to do it is to have uniform and fair standards. Right now, there's a very interesting phenomenon happening. And I alluded to the debates that are happening now about anti-Semitism. And there are great debates about whether expanding the protections, right, from anti-Semitic threats will also kind of collapse into actually criminalizing pro-Palestinian speech, and will turn into basically penalizing other people for what they want to say about Israel and Palestinian conflict and all those types of things. The simple way, perhaps, is to say that if you create a law or a standard to have special protections, it should be uniform, and that we should do what law has always done in this country, which is to say, we create these categories and then we apply them indiscriminately. And if you do that, we can test these cases out, and we can basically get a more, I think, a more measured approach to this. But the third thing I would say is it will require us to basically perhaps make some distinctions also about where we do the speech. And I think one of the biggest problems we have in society today is that we kind of lost the ability to make a distinction between what you should be able to say on the internet in this forum, or on a social media forum, versus what you can say in the town square, what you can write in the newspaper versus what you can put on your Facebook page. As we all know, this is being fiercely debated by people, but those distinctions do matter. And what you have a right to say under the laws of the land versus what privately people have to listen to or don't have to listen to. Right at the moments I've been talking about in the talk tonight, people were really trying to parse that out and trying to say, well, maybe we need more robust protections against media, actually, because there the hate spreads in a viral fashion. And certainly today we see that. And maybe what we should be able to do is say that is an area. But if you're walking or protesting in the street, you should be able to say more, right? And those distinctions are, I would say, we all have to think more about them. I don't have a policy that I'm going to say we all have to do, but I think it's reasonable to imagine that as technology changes, we can develop more policies and laws to regulate it reasonably, and to make the distinctions between what is something that you can say on Twitter and attacking someone, and what is something that you can say in a college classroom or a federal courthouse or something.
A question from Bonnie and Ellis Diamond about the Supreme Court. Would you like to go ahead and phrase that yourself?
Yeah, thank you. My question really is, given the fact that all of these cases, when they're heard, they go to the Supreme Court for final decisions, it's very difficult for a court that's becoming less liberal to embrace liberal considerations and concepts in their formulation in judging cases, so that some of what we would want is really irrelevant.
Right. Thank you for that question. That's a terrific question. And you're right. And if we compare today to that moment, basically what happened after World War II was that these civil rights activists, Jewish and others, bet on the courts, and they basically said the courts are the place we're going to go to make the social change. There were, of course, the Civil Rights Act was a major role, played a role in this. But then stretching it and doing more and more to kind of stamp out the hatred and seek equality was done largely through the courts. And the perception was judges will interpret the law correctly and it'll work to our benefit. That's not necessarily the case anymore for those who wanted to push in that direction. I think that, there are different solutions one could propose. One would be, we need to focus more, those of us who want to advance social change should focus more on Congress and on laws and state legislatures. Yes, cases are eventually going to make their way up there, but there are a lot of opportunities for making change on the local and state and even federal level that don't always run through the courts. A second thing I would say is, what has happened is that many different types of activist groups have decided to focus a lot of their resources on the courts. And in response to the question, if I could kind of bend it back and connect it to the question from, I believe it was Lorraine Ratner, what can people do? Well, there's a host of organizations out there now who are being very creative and assertive about saying, if the court is going to be doing this, then we're going to have to become more creative with laws, and we're going to have to basically watch very closely the cases at the lower levels so that a conservative group can't necessarily ram it all the way up and ram it through. We should be able to be more to mobilize to do that. But the final thing I would say is, and there may be people on this call who identify more with the right side of the aisle, and I think that I don't fear a court that changes, because courts are always going to change over time. And I do think having an honest conversation about what we want civil rights to look like, and recognizing the contradictions and the challenges in it, that it's actually always a trade-off, I think can be a healthy way to go. And I go back to what I've said before, that in some respects, we ran a conference earlier this year at my university in Virginia about these issues, more of a policy conference with a lot of law professors. And one of the things that emerged was that, in a strange way, there are many conservatives today who are almost the communitarians in the story I've just told you, because they want to say, because of my religious beliefs or my beliefs about sexuality, I want to be protected so I can practice this, and I want to have a carve out the way the laws work. Or I want to be able to be protected from speech that I think will injure me. And that's often a conservative position, even as there are liberals and progressives who will say, we need to get rid of racist speech. So we're in a strange, and I think the more we can talk honestly and challenge one another about these things, we will be able to think about this. And also, it's not foreordained what the court will do on all of these things. I know many commentators believe that, but I think there have been some surprises lately. And in the book, I talk about some other surprising moments where conservative justices actually favor some progressive ideas. So history is still being written.
There's a question from Arnold Gass. Arnold, would you like to phrase this?
Thank you. Well, you've actually answered most of my question, but the bottom line of my question was that there'll always be a tension between liberty of absolute free speech and the need to protect against hate speech and the violence that may come with it. And I originally asked, is there ever going to be an end to this tension by way of the law? And then as I was thinking about this, you answered my question about how do modern methods of communication change this dynamic. Are groups and coalitions losing traction in this fight? And protesters and counter-protesters taking to the streets make a point and may push the issue to the forefront, but may foreclose the kind of openness and debate that you said. So I would actually redirect the question is, what is liberalism and what is conservatism these days? Because I believe that the traditional things are breaking down. So that'll be my question.
Yes. No, that's a wonderful question. And in the book that I'm writing slowly as we speak, in a way, what I want to suggest is that these debates, not just the hate speech, free speech, but the debates about anti-Semitism flare up, and anti-Semitism flares up at moments when liberalism is in crisis, right? So you're right. I think we're going through one of those periods. What that means for this, I think it means we're waking up to the power that media does have in our lives, and we're waking up to the question of how much we want the government to be doing more with it versus how much we want Twitter and Facebook should regulate their own speech, right? So and that's something where I actually am optimistic, because I do think it cuts, as I kind of alluded to a minute ago, it cuts in surprising ways, right? There are many conservatives who don't want tech to have as much power as it has, and there are many liberals who don't want that. And there are many conservatives who say, let the market do what it's going to do. Don't regulate companies, right? So I think that in that complex thing, there's space for people to think this through. We're never going to get rid of these tensions, but we can, I think, reimagine liberalism and update it, if you really want to put it in crude tech terms, to meet the challenges. It is not surprising that we're going through this at a period in which America's changing, right? What it looks like, as President Biden says, what America looks like changes. And these are issues that are directly tied to that. The flip side of that is I don't think that they're always destined to be tearing us apart if we can get other things figured out. But I'm not a politician. I'm just a college professor. So I'll go on writing the books and trying to explain this. And hopefully the political leaders will figure out some good solutions.
So we have a follow-up comment from Peter Gorovich about relying on the courts versus voting. Peter, would you like to voice that comment?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to turn that into a question, which is, well, the comment I made was that maybe we should, should we rely on the courts so much? I, as a liberal, my comment was, as a liberal, I find our reliance on the court not a good thing. I think many of these issues are things that the public should decide. They should be decided in legislation, and we go to the public to decide lots of issues. Why shouldn't the people decide things? So maybe we shouldn't be relying on the courts and be fighting these things out in the legislature and through arguments that take place to get resolved in legislation. And even with conservative judges, legislation can actually shape and constrain what they're able to do. So I wonder if you would, let me turn it into a question. What is your opinion of that? Do you think we should be working for these goals that we're talking about? Should we be working on strategies that have to deal with legislatures and presidency and fighting our arguments there and focusing less on courts?
I'm going to go ahead, if you don't mind. I'm going to just add to that because we're sort of coming near to the end.
Please ask the next question because I'd like to know the answer to that.
Well, we can maybe we'll maybe collect the last questions and then Professor Leffler can answer those. And this would be the point in the evening when, if we were meeting in person, I would invite you to refresh your wine or your tea. And once we've gotten through the questions that are on stack, we'll leave the room open for a little bit in case people want to ask questions after we've turned the recording off. So let's just, Arthur Skora had asked, why are Jews so often linked to socialism? And Paul Meyer also has a question that I'd like for him to ask in person. Paul, do you want to go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll collect the remaining questions?
I'd be glad to. From my perspective, much of the discussion has been about the conflict between these two schools of thought about dealing with free speech and hate speech, and a conflict between whether the courts or the legislature should be the focus of our attention. But isn't it so that the two needn't be thought of as being in conflict? Why aren't we working toward a confluence of both? We all know that free speech is not unlimited. Reasonable restraints as to time, place, and manner are acceptable. We all know that the courts and the legislature can work hand in hand. And I think probably all of us on the call are pretty excited about the IHRA definition, which I think will help courts through the confluence of legislation and judicial decision-making. Isn't it so that these should be thought of as two arrows in our quiver rather than two arrows aimed at one another?
Thank you. So, yeah, I mean, working backwards, I do think that is very much the case that, we create these archetypal poles, but so much of what happens in politics is about the interaction between them. And I think you're right about that. As I said earlier, one of the things that is less helpful is our tendency to say there's hate speech and free speech. Are you for free speech? Are you for hate speech? Do you want to ban hate speech? In reality, they interact, right? And some of the sophisticated thinking in the mid 20th century was about not just what's the line, but understanding them in terms of how we promote speech and how we restrict speech, right? And that process takes place with the courts and with legislatures. So I think you're right, they work together. And this turns us back to Peter's question, that yeah, I do think at this moment in time, to secure some of this, to secure some of the change and adapt some of our laws to the realities we face, the legislature is a stronger place to focus, but not to the exclusion of the courts, right? Now, I want to throw in a curveball if I could. There's one other factor, and Paul Meyer just spoke, mentioned reference to an international definition of anti-Semitism. We could spend 3 hours discussing it. But the important thing to note is there's always also the international option, right? Amelia Glazer mentioned it in this moment right after the war. Some people were saying, well, what about international human rights law to help with social justice at home in the US? Should people be able to appeal above the heads of the US government to the UN, right? This didn't happen, right? Because the American right was very, very against this, but many parts of the American left also said, we don't want America to be constrained by this form of international human rights. Well, our democracy is fine, right? That can be for other parts of the world. And we also face that debate today, as though some people say, one way to improve democracy in America is to make us join not only more climate treaties, but legal agreements about human rights. And we should give over some authority to the UN and to international courts. That's interesting because I think exceptionalism, a belief, which I would define this case as a belief that America's democracy is so strong, so unique that we don't need that, seems to push people away from that. And all you have to do is look at the Democratic and Republican parties, how much they both share kind of resistance to the International Criminal Court. There are reasons to be skeptical about its authority and efficacy, and even its bias, but it is an option that is there. And I think many people in different countries at this moment in time, thinking about the democracy, recession, if you will, are saying, well, the hope is that international institutions and courts can check our own governments and our own judiciaries if they're not, going the way we want them to go. That's a whole other can of worms, right? And that's a really interesting dilemma, especially when it comes to anti-Semitism. Having international legal standards can be helpful, but there are repercussions that come with them for other aspects of American foreign policy and debates about the politicization of it. That's something that I talk about that in the end part of this book, because I really try and understand what happened after Charlottesville, and how domestic questions about anti-Semitism suddenly got dragged into international questions. So but that is both a quagmire, and it is a place of opportunity that I imagine we will all hear more and more people talking over the next few years about can international law help us in America fight hate? And others say international law is finished. It doesn't have a legitimacy. Just to take this question about socialism, the fact of the matter is that there are interesting questions about Jews and politics and socialism in the 20th century and before and beyond. But there is also a trope which emerges of it known as the Judeo-Bolshevik myth, which is that all communists are Jews and all Jews are communists, and that therefore the threat to take your pick, Christian values or to non-communists or to America or to Europe or to the German people is uniquely emanating from this constellation. And that linkage was formed through a number of different things. We can talk more about it, but the bottom line is it became a myth, and it's lived its life, and it continues to live on in terms of demonizing Jews and kind of turning this into a kind of a mythical monster that you heard me mention even at the beginning of the talk tonight when talking about the comments about Judeo-communists taking over our country. Oh wait,
we're a bit. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, we're a bit over time already, and I hope you'll all join me in thanking James Loeffler for this really stimulating talk and conversation. And Jim, if you don't mind, I'll leave the Zoom on for a minute, because sometimes people will want to maybe come up and introduce themselves in this virtual format before we close it in about 5 minutes. I'll stop the recording, but I want to thank you all for coming, and I'll see you in April.